Have you ever walked out of a meeting thinking, I knew exactly what I wanted to say, but somehow I still sounded like the new person in the room? I know I have. And what's the surprising part? It had nothing to do with my expertise. It was literally the vocabulary that I was using. When I first left academia and started consulting full time, I expected my biggest learning curve to be strategy, client management, or figuring out how to price my work. And while I did struggle with some of those topics, it probably wasn't one of my biggest struggles. My biggest, or one of my biggest struggles, and honestly silliest, hurdles was learning the corporate lingo. Now, every profession has its own vocabulary. In higher ed, I could casually talk about formative assessment, learning outcomes, or instructional design without thinking twice. Everyone around me knew exactly what I meant. But when I moved to corporate, I found that they spoke their own language. So I'm Jennifer. I'm from the Freelance Shift. Thanks for joining us today. I help freelancers and solopreneurs learn skills that will help them to earn money and save time. I've been able to build a often multiple six-figure freelance business over the past several years since leaving academia. If this interests you, please consider subscribing. So oftentimes the challenge is that you know the concept, but not the word that everyone else uses for it. For instance, when I was working a gig with Microsoft, it was one of the first ones that I was doing full time. I remember suggesting that we include a case study into an onboarding training that we were making for a group there. Now, overall, the response was positive. Everyone liked the idea when I explained the idea, but before I got to the explanation, there was a pause. And I only realized why when someone eventually said, "Oh, you mean a use case?" Now, basically, they're synonymous. It's basically the same thing, but different terminology. Now, another example, and this has gone across several corporate clients that I've worked with. I learned this one pretty quickly. I was calling my PowerPoint a presentation. Now, I know that technically it is, but I quickly learned that in corporate America, or at least where I work, it's not a presentation. It's a PowerPoint or it's a deck. So people don't often say, "Can you send me the presentation?" I guess sometimes, but the more common terminology is, "Can you send me the deck? Can you update the deck?" or something along those lines. So for that one, no one actually cared that I called it a presentation, but I did find that I felt a little more cohesive with the team when I changed the language to be the same that the other people on the team were using. It helped me feel like I belonged. As silly as that might sound, it really did help me feel like I was starting to fit in. Now, of course, one thing that I at least have learned is that looking like a professional freelancer isn't about acting like someone you're not, but it does involve reducing unnecessary friction when you can. So if your audience has to mentally translate your language every time that you speak, you're making them work just a little bit harder. So if you're able to adopt the terminology that your clients and your colleagues already use, your conversations are going to flow more naturally. Now, you're not changing your expertise, you're just packaging what you have in a slightly different but familiar to the client language. Every industry has its own dialect. And obviously, coming from academia, we did too. We had our own acronyms and jargon and phrases that made perfect sense to those of us on the inside, but sounded completely foreign to everyone else. Now, corporate isn't any different. Healthcare isn't any different. Neither is finance or manufacturing. Insert any industry that you're in. Every industry develops shorthand because it makes communication faster within the group. So it was just a mindset change for me. Once I stopped thinking of corporate language as buzzwords and started just viewing it as a different professional dialect, it became much easier to learn. Now, I have good news for you. The good news is that you don't need to memorize a giant glossary before your first client meeting. Although, no joke, a couple of the clients that I work for do have an online acronym dictionary for all of the acronyms that they use because it is so difficult for people to learn them. Now, hopefully you don't have to deal with one of those. Instead, I would recommend treating learning the terminology the same way you would if you were learning a new discipline. And that's basically listen for repeated words. Pay attention during meetings. If you hear the same word come up several times, it's probably important. So, for instance, one of the common ones is that oftentimes people don't say participants in the corporate world. They say stakeholders. Another one is some groups don't say plan. Instead, they say roadmap. Or maybe they say action items instead of next steps. They're very little things. And again, all of those are synonymous, just as we spoke about a little earlier. But you want to try your best to utilize the language that the group is used to and that they already align with. So pay attention to the repeated words. They're clues about how organizations think and communicate. Now, I know I made a joke about the companies that have their own large glossary, but you could actually start your own glossary. And now I'm not recommending anything fancy. I'm just literally recommending like a page in OneNote or a Word or a Google Doc. Anything where you can write down the new term, what it means, the context it was used in, and any equivalent term that you're already familiar with. This is going to give you that new vocabulary very, very quickly. So another way that you can learn the terminology the client uses is by reading it. So I would recommend really taking a look at the documents that they reference. What did the previous decks and proposals and project documentation, annual reports, maybe even their website or messages in your Teams channel, how were they worded? What was the terms? Notice how they describe problems, solutions, customers, and success. Now, you'll notice if everyone involved in these conversations or all of the documentation that you review consistently uses a particular term. And that's probably the term that you should use too. That's going to help you borrow language naturally. It's something that's worth trying. You can basically mirror what other people say. So if your client refers to business capabilities, then use that phrase the next time you're talking about that. Similarly, if they talk about customers instead of users, follow that lead. Use the same terminology. Now, you shouldn't parrot them, obviously. You just want to align and speak their language, which will make communication easier for everyone. Now, you're not always going to use the right word, right? That's just realistic. But something that helped me tremendously is that I learned you don't have to pretend to know every piece of the terminology. You just need to recover gracefully. So if you notice that people have puzzled expressions after you ask a question, use a certain term, don't panic. Simply translate it yourself. For instance, I'd like to include a case study. Note the puzzled faces on people. And then add, or I think you might call it a use case. Another example would be what I would call a presentation, or rather the deck. That tiny correction is going to accomplish two things. First, it shows that you're flexible in trying to communicate in your client's language. Second, it keeps the conversation moving instead of getting stuck on terminology, which is obviously something that you don't want to do. I'd recommend starting to do this intentionally whenever you're not sure of the client terms that you preferred. I tried that strategy and it did work for me. I'd say something like, in higher ed, we called it this. I think your organization might be calling it Y. Or I said, in higher education, we called it this. What is your terminology for it? And almost every time someone would respond with, yes, we call it Y. Great. Now I know for next time. Now those little moments are going to become opportunities for you to learn instead of moments where you feel embarrassed. So looking back at all of this, I almost laugh at how much mental energy I spent worrying about getting the terminology right. But I was the new girl on the block and I wanted to make sure that I fit in. I wanted to be successful. I didn't want to regret changing careers when I did after having a lot of experience in the classroom. So I learned that the expertise I'd built in academia did transfer over surprisingly well. The vocabulary was just another skill to learn. So if you're transitioning into freelancing or any new industry and you occasionally feel like someone else received a secret glossary that you somehow missed, I don't think that you're alone. And that's okay because as professionals, we're not born knowing the language of every industry. That's not realistic. We learn by listening, observing, asking questions, and adapting. Your knowledge got you in the room. You're going to learn the dialect and be able to speak it very quickly. You know your knowledge got you in the room, and learning the dialect is simply going to help everyone hear your message more clearly. Thanks for watching. See you next time.